The photograph had yellowed with age, its edges curled like dying leaves. Victor Ashridge held it with hands that had killed more men than he could count, yet trembled now as they traced the faces of ghosts. 40 years had passed since the night captured in that image. 40 years since Ravencrest burned. He stood alone in his war room, surrounded by maps and battle plans that would mean nothing if his memories continued to devour him from the inside. The photo showed ruins, smoke rising from collapsed stone, bodies scattered like broken toys across ground that had drunk too much blood too quickly. And there, in the corner, barely visible through the haze, a boy crouched in the shadows, 12 years old, watching his father die. That boy had been him. Victor set the photo down with more care than it deserved. The war room smelled of old leather and newer ambitions. 3 territorial maps dominated the far wall, marked with positions and patrol routes that had taken months to gather. Shadow Ridge, the Ironwolf pack, the target that would finally let him sleep without screaming. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sharp, military precise. His second entered without waiting for permission. Commander Reese had earned that privilege through 15 years of loyal brutality. "You summoned me, Alpha." Victor gestured to the intelligence report on his desk. The pages had been read so many times the ink had started to fade in places where his fingers had traced the same lines over and over, searching for something he had finally found. "Tell me about the girl." Reese moved to the desk with the economy of motion that came from decades of combat. He had been a Continental Army Ranger before the politics of pack life had drawn him into Victor's service. Some men were born for war, others had it carved into them through necessity and loss. Sera Blackthorn, 25 years old, intelligence specialist for Shadow Ridge, no recorded shift ability. Pack records list her as defective. Victor's jaw tightened. The word defective carried weight in their world. Werewolves who could not shift were less than worthless. They were reminders that genetics could fail, that the blood could run weak, that not every child born to their kind deserved the gift of 2 forms. And her bloodline? Reese hesitated. That pause spoke volumes. In all their years together, the commander had never hesitated to deliver intelligence, no matter how dark or damning. Whatever came next would change everything. Her grandmother was Elena Thornwood, Shadowborn. The word hit Victor like a physical blow. His vision tunneled. The war room disappeared, replaced by flames and screaming and silver fire that consumed flesh and stone with equal hunger. He gripped the desk's edge hard enough that wood creaked under his fingers. Shadowborn died out 40 years ago. Reese's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held the weight of terrible truths. The kind of truths that reshaped the world if you let them breathe. Apparently not. Our source confirms Elena went into hiding after Ravencrest, took her daughter north. The daughter later mated with a human. Sera is the result. Half human. Victor processed this information with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 4 decades of increasingly desperate hunts. Half human meant diluted blood. It should have meant weakness. But Shadowborn genetics did not follow normal rules. Their power was dominant, aggressive. It devoured weaker bloodlines and emerged stronger for it. Does she know what she is? Reese shook his head. The intelligence suggests the bloodline was suppressed, deliberately hidden. She believes she is defective. The pack believes she is defective. But our analysts ran the genetic markers. If she ever awakens, she will be more dangerous than her grandmother. Victor turned to the window. Beyond the glass, his territory stretched toward the horizon in patterns of forest and controlled development that represented 30 years of careful expansion. He had built an empire on the ashes of his father's failure. Every decision, every battle, every calculated risk had been designed to prevent history from repeating itself. He had sworn no Shadowborn would ever rise again. Not after what they had done to Ravencrest. Not after what they had taken from him. The memory came unbidden, as it always did, sharp and clear despite the decades. His father, Alpha Darius Ashridge, had been a hard man. The kind of leader who ruled through fear and maintained order through controlled violence. Young Victor had learned early that weakness was death, that sentiment was suicide, that a pack survived only when its alpha held absolute power. But Darius had wanted more than survival. He had wanted perfection. The Shadowborn pair had arrived during a diplomatic summit, Alpha Matthias Darkwater and his bonded mate, Elena Thornwood. Victor remembered them with crystalline clarity. Matthias, tall and commanding, with eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Elena, beautiful and terrible, with shadows that moved independently of any light source and silver fire that danced along her skin when emotion ran high. Darius had been obsessed with them. He had studied their power, their bond, the way they moved as one consciousness divided between two bodies. And he had decided that such power should belong to Ravencrest, should belong to him. Victor had been too young to understand the politics. He knew only that his father had ordered Elena taken, had decided to breed her to Ravencrest males until she produced offspring Darius could control and mold into perfect weapons, had believed that Shadowborn power without the balance of a true mate bond would create soldiers who could conquer the continent. Matthias and Elena had responded with the kind of violence that legends were born from. Victor remembered hiding in the cellar as the fortress burned above him. He remembered the screams of warriors who had served his father faithfully for decades. He remembered creeping to a window and seeing his father on his knees, begging for mercy, while silver fire consumed him from the inside out. Elena's voice had carried through the chaos with supernatural clarity. "We do not kill innocents, but tyrants die screaming." 300 pack members had died that night. Women, children, elders who had nothing to do with Darius's ambitions. The Shadowborn pair had shown no mercy, no restraint, no humanity. They had burned Ravencrest to ash and disappeared into legend, leaving only a 12-year-old boy to carry the weight of genocide. For 40 years, Victor had hunted their bloodline. He had tracked every rumor, followed every lead, eliminated every potential Shadowborn he could find. 16 confirmed kills across 4 decades. 16 abominations prevented from rising to destroy another pack the way Ravencrest had been destroyed. And now this. Sera Blackthorn, hidden where he should have found her years ago. Growing stronger with each passing day, her power suppressed, but not dead. Waiting for the right trigger to awaken and begin the cycle of destruction all over again. Victor turned back to Rhys. His decision had been made the moment he learned what she was. Some choices required no deliberation, no moral wrestling, no hesitation. Some choices were simply the price of preventing greater evils. Assemble the Alliance. 3 packs, full mobilization. We move against Shadow Ridge in 72 hours. Rhys's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. A full assault requires justification. The Continental Council will demand answers. Victor's smile held no warmth. Then we will tell them that Shadow Ridge harbors a Shadowborn abomination. We will tell them that we are preventing another Ravencrest. We will be heroes, Rhys. Saviors who stopped a genocide before it could begin. The commander nodded slowly. His loyalty was absolute, but his tactical mind demanded clarity. And the Ironwolf Alpha? Cade has significant military reputation. The Continental Army speaks highly of his service record. Let him come. Victor's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Let him try to defend the abomination. When we kill her, we will be eliminating a threat. When we kill him, we will be removing an obstacle. Either way, Shadow Ridge falls at dawn in 72 hours. Rhys saluted and departed to begin the mobilization. Victor remained at the window, watching darkness creep across his territory as the sun died slowly in the west. Somewhere beyond his borders, Sera Blackthorn lived her last days in ignorance. She would never awaken, never realize what she could have become, never have the chance to destroy everything he had spent 40 years protecting. This was mercy, he told himself, a quick death before the monster inside her could emerge and feast on innocence. He was doing the right thing, the necessary thing, the thing his father should have done before obsession consumed him. Victor picked up the photograph again, studied the ruins of Ravencrest one more time, remembered the smell of burning flesh and the sound of his own sobbing as he had crawled through ash looking for survivors who did not exist. History would not repeat itself. He would make certain of it, even if he had to burn another territory to ash to prevent it. The photograph curled further in his grip, edges crumbling into dust. Some memories refused to die, no matter how hard you tried to bury them. Some ghosts demanded blood before they would rest. In 72 hours, Victor would give them what they wanted. Across the border, in the ancient fortress that had guarded Shadow Ridge for 3 centuries, another man wrestled with ghosts that refused to stay buried. Cade Ironwolf stood at the highest tower window and watched moonlight paint silver patterns across territory he had sworn to protect. The view was beautiful, peaceful. It told comfortable lies about the world being safe and ordered and predictable. Cade knew better. He was 38 years old and felt twice that on bad days. The scars that decorated his body told stories he would rather forget, but could never escape. 10 years in the Continental Army Rangers. 237 confirmed missions. 12 men under his direct command when the final operation went sideways and turned into the kind of nightmare that recruiting posters never mentioned. The mission had been simple on paper: extract 200 civilians from a war zone before rival packs tore them apart in their territorial dispute. Cade's squad had been the best, precision instruments of military efficiency with years of experience backing every decision. They had saved every single civilian. All 200 had made it to safety. The cost had been 12 Rangers who would never return home to their families. 12 men who had trusted Cade's leadership right up until the moment that leadership got them killed. The Continental Army had called it a heroic success, had pinned medals on Cade's chest while he stood at attention and felt nothing but the crushing weight of names he would carry forever. Marcus Chen, David Rodriguez, Thomas Whitfield. He could recite all 12 from memory, along with their ranks, their ages, their families' names. The living carried the dead. That was the price of command. Cade had resigned his commission 6 months later, had returned to his birth pack with the intention of living quietly, serving without leading, existing without the burden of decisions that got good men killed. Shadow Ridge had other plans. Their alpha had died without an heir, and pack law was clear. The strongest capable wolf inherited the mantle. Cade had refused 3 times. Each refusal had been met with increasing desperation from pack elders who saw their territory vulnerable without proper leadership. The 4th time they asked, Cade had simply looked at them and said the truth he had been avoiding for months. "I am not a hero. I am a man who gets people killed. You deserve better." The eldest had responded with words that still haunted him. "Then lead us so well that no one has to die. That is what we need. Not a hero, a tactician who understands the cost of failure." So Cade had accepted, had taken the alpha mantle with the same reluctant duty that had characterized his entire military career, had spent 3 years building Shadow Ridge into one of the most defensively capable territories on the continent, had implemented protocols and training regimens and strategic partnerships that made direct assault nearly impossible. And then, 3 months ago, everything had started falling apart. It began with dreams. Vivid, consuming visions that felt more like memories than imagination. Silver eyes in darkness. A voice he did not recognize calling to him across impossible distances. The sensation of something missing, something vital, something that would make him whole if he could only find it. His wolf had woken from the dreams with desperate hunger, a need that transcended physical desire and approached spiritual starvation. "Find her." The words had echoed through his consciousness with increasing urgency as the weeks passed. "She is close. She is ours. Find her before it is too late." Cade had dismissed it at first. Stress dreams. The mind processing trauma through symbolic imagery. Nothing that required action or concern. But the dreams intensified. The need grew stronger. His wolf began fighting for control during waking hours, pushing him toward the eastern territories where intelligence operations were headquartered. The violent episodes had started 2 months ago. Cade would be reviewing reports or training with warriors when his wolf would surge forward without warning. Bones would crack and shift. His vision would flood with gold. The need to hunt, to search, to claim would become so overwhelming that rational thought evaporated like morning mist. The first time it happened, he had nearly killed 2 warriors who tried to restrain him. The second time, he had shattered an oak door that had stood for a century. By the 5th episode, Cade had ordered himself confined to the tower during his most vulnerable hours, had stationed guards outside with orders to kill him if he broke containment and threatened the pack. Lieutenant Garrett Stone had refused that particular order. The old warrior had served Shadow Ridge for 30 years and had known Cade since childhood. His response had been characteristically blunt. "I am not killing you because your wolf wants something you are too stubborn to acknowledge. Figure out what it needs, or learn to live in that tower forever. Those are your options." But Cade did not know what his wolf wanted. The dreams showed him nothing concrete, just silver eyes and shadows and a voice that promised wholeness if he would only surrender to the hunt. It made no sense. He had no mate, had deliberately avoided romantic entanglements because the risk of loss was something he could not bear to experience again. Loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. Cade had been destroyed enough, so he fought. He resisted the wolf's demands. He stayed locked in the tower and let his second-in-command manage daily pack operations, while he wrestled with instincts that seemed designed to drive him mad. Tonight was the 73rd night of isolation. Cade had marked each one with a scratch on the stone wall beside his bed. 73 days of fighting himself. 73 nights of dreams that left him gasping and desperate when he woke. 73 dawns where he questioned whether leadership was worth this particular cost. His wolf stirred as moonlight shifted across the tower floor. Not the violent surge that had characterized recent episodes, but something different. A sudden, absolute stillness that felt more dangerous than any rage. "She comes." The words materialized in his mind with perfect clarity. Not his own thoughts, but his wolf's consciousness bleeding through the barriers Cade had erected to maintain sanity. His wolf sounded certain, satisfied, as if something long sought had finally been found. Cade moved to the window and searched the darkness below. Nothing, just empty courtyards and silent walls and the normal patrol patterns that kept Shadow Ridge secure. Whatever his wolf sensed, it was not yet visible to human eyes. "She comes to save us." The wolf's voice carried tones Cade had never heard from it before. Something approaching reverence. She is pack. She is ours. She is everything. Madness. It had to be madness. 3 months of isolation and stress had finally broken something fundamental in his mind. Cade turned from the window and moved to the small desk where he kept his personal journal. Maybe writing it down would help. Maybe putting the delusions on paper would let him see how far he had fallen. He never reached the desk. A sound froze him mid-step. Footsteps. Light. Careful. Moving up the tower stairs with the kind of cautious precision that spoke of either extensive training or well-developed paranoia. The guards should have stopped anyone from approaching. The fact that footsteps continued meant either the guards were dead or someone had bypassed them with skills that made noise discipline an art form. Cade's tactical mind engaged automatically, pushing aside the wolf's strange certainty to focus on immediate threat assessment. One person. Light frame based on footfall pattern. Moving with purpose, but not aggression. Someone who knew the tower's layout well enough to avoid the creaking steps on the third landing. His hand moved to the silver dagger he kept on the desk. Not his preferred weapon, but deadly enough if the intruder proved hostile. He positioned himself beside the door, waiting. Breathing controlled and shallow, ready to strike or retreat depending on what came through that door. The footsteps stopped just outside. A pause. Cade could almost feel the person on the other side gathering courage for whatever came next. Then, soft as a whisper, knuckles rapped against ancient oak in a pattern that made his wolf sing with recognition. "She is here." Cade opened the door. The woman on the other side froze like a deer that had just realized it was standing in a predator's den. She was small, maybe 5'4", with a build that suggested whipcord strength hidden under deceptively slight proportions. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, green eyes that caught the lamplight and threw it back with unexpected intensity. She wore the dark tactical clothing of Shadow Ridge's intelligence division and carried herself with the coiled readiness of someone trained to fight despite physical disadvantages. Cade knew her. Sera Blackthorn. He had seen her around the fortress, always in the background, always observing. She filed intelligence reports that were masterpieces of tactical analysis, had a reputation for being able to infiltrate places that should have been impenetrable. Rumored to be defective, unable to shift, carrying the shame of incomplete genetics like a weight that never eased. She should not be here. No unmated female entered the Alpha's private chambers. The law was absolute. The punishment was death. Yet here she stood, and Cade's wolf was not demanding her blood. It was demanding something else entirely. "You should not be here." His voice came out rougher than intended. 3 months of minimal conversation had left his words raw and unpracticed. "Whatever brings you to this door, it is not worth your life." Sera met his eyes without flinching. That alone marked her as either brave or suicidal. Alphas in unstable states were not known for restraint or mercy. The fact that she stood her ground spoke to either tremendous courage or complete ignorance of the danger she had just walked into. 3 packs mobilized against us. Her voice was steady despite the fear he could smell rolling off her in waves. They attack at dawn. You need to know their strategy. Dawn. Cade processed this information with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive through 100 combat situations. He glanced at the window. Darkness still held, but the quality of that darkness suggested dawn was perhaps 4 hours away. 4 hours to prepare for an assault that should have had at least a day's warning through their intelligence network. How do you know this? I infiltrated their war council 3 hours ago. Sera's eyes held the kind of steady focus that came from looking at death and deciding to document it rather than run. Victor Ashridge leads the alliance. He knows about my bloodline. This attack is not conquest, it is assassination. Her bloodline. Cade's tactical mind caught the phrasing, the emphasis, the weight she gave to those words that suggested depths he had not previously considered. His wolf surged forward without warning, drawn by something in her scent that suddenly registered as fundamentally important. Cedar smoke and wildflowers. That was her base scent. But underneath, almost hidden, lay something else. Something that called to his wolf with the same desperate urgency that had plagued his dreams for 3 months. Silver fire and shadow. The scent of old magic. The signature of a bloodline that should not exist. What is your bloodline? Sera's expression flickered with emotions too complex to name. Fear, resignation, defiance, a strange kind of relief, as if finally speaking truth after years of lies. Shadowborn. My grandmother was Elena Thornwood. She hid me, suppressed my abilities to keep me safe. But Victor discovered the truth. He comes to kill me before I can awaken. Shadowborn. The word should have triggered every defensive instinct Cade possessed. Stories of their power were taught to every pup as cautionary tales. Shadowborn could walk between dimensions, could manipulate darkness itself, could amplify an alpha's power to godlike levels if properly bonded. They were myth and nightmare made flesh. They were also supposed to be extinct. Cade's wolf reacted to the revelation with something approaching religious ecstasy. Mate. The certainty was absolute. Undeniable. This was what the dreams had been showing him. This was what his instincts had been screaming for 3 months. Not just any female, but this specific woman with her hidden bloodline and her tremendous courage and her scent that made his wolf want to kill anything that threatened her. Show me your intelligence. The words came out steadier than he felt. If Victor attacks at dawn, we have limited time to prepare an adequate defense. Sera moved past him into the chamber with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own body, despite what genetics had denied her. She carried a pack over one shoulder. From it, she produced hand-drawn maps marked with positions and patrol routes and strategic weak points that represented months of careful observation. Cade moved to examine the maps, acutely aware of her presence beside him. She smelled of the night air and recent adrenaline and that underlying scent of shadow magic that made his wolf sing with need. When she leaned over to point out a specific enemy position, her shoulder brushed against his arm. The contact sent electricity racing through his nervous system. Simple touch that carried the weight of destiny. 3 packs. Sera's finger traced alliance positions with practiced precision. Victor's force here. Alpha Gregor's warriors here. Alpha Sera's contingent providing rear support. Total estimated strength between 400 and 500 warriors. Shadow Ridge's standing military was maybe 200 strong. A direct confrontation would be slaughter. Cade's tactical mind raced through options and scenarios with the desperate speed of someone who had done this calculus too many times before. Defensive positions, strategic retreats, acceptable losses, the algebra of survival written in blood and sacrifice. Their strategy assumes you will lead from the front. Sera's voice pulled him back from dark calculations. Victor believes your instability will make you either completely absent or dangerously unpredictable. He is counting on Shadow Ridge being leaderless. But I am not absent. Cade studied the maps with fresh eyes, seeing possibilities he had missed in his initial assessment. And I am not unpredictable. Not anymore. Because his wolf had gone completely still. For the first time in 3 months, the desperate need to hunt and search and claim had vanished, replaced by perfect calm. The wolf had found what it sought. Now it waited with predatory patience for the moment to strike. Sera looked up at him. This close, he could see silver flecks in her green eyes. something that should not be there unless Shadowborn blood ran very close to the surface. Her power was suppressed, but not dead, not even close to dead. "Why did you come here?" The question emerged softer than he intended. "You could have delivered this intelligence to Lieutenant Stone. You did not need to risk execution by entering my chambers." Something flickered across her expression. Vulnerability quickly hidden but not quickly enough. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of truths that cost something to speak. "Because I have watched you for 3 months, watched you isolate yourself, watched you fight your wolf like it was the enemy. I know what it is like to believe you are broken, to think that something fundamental inside you is wrong and will only hurt the people you care about." She paused, and her eyes held his with uncomfortable intensity. "I came because I knew you would not save yourself, so I decided to save you instead." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Cade had spent 3 months believing he was protecting his pack through isolation, had convinced himself that his containment was noble sacrifice, had never considered that someone might be watching and seeing not strength, but slow suicide. "Your wolf is not out of control." Sera continued with the kind of gentle certainty that felt like absolution and accusation combined. "It is searching for something, for someone. And if my intelligence is correct, it started searching 3 months ago." "3 months ago," Cade echoed. "When did you return from Northern reconnaissance?" Sera's breath caught. Understanding dawned in her eyes, the same understanding that had just slammed into Cade with the force of revelation. 3 months ago. I was gone for 6 weeks doing deep intelligence work in hostile territory. I returned 3 months ago. His wolf had started searching the same day she returned. The correlation was too perfect to be coincidence. Somehow, on a level deeper than conscious thought, his wolf had recognized what she was, had known that a Shadowborn walked Shadow Ridge's halls, had been trying to lead him to her so they could fulfill a bond that predated pack law and human hesitation. The mate bond, the rarest connection in their world. When it formed, it was absolute, undeniable, the foundation for partnerships that could reshape the political landscape if cultivated properly. It was also completely forbidden to claim before proper courtship rituals. The law existed for good reason. Forced bonds created corrupted power. True bonds required choice, time, and mutual consent. But they had 4 hours until dawn and an army at their gates. Time was a luxury they did not possess. Sera seemed to read his thoughts. Her next words came soft as a prayer and hard as steel. "If we survive this, we can explore what this means. Right now, I need you functional. The pack needs its alpha. So whatever your wolf has been demanding, give it enough to stabilize. Then we plan our defense." Cade's wolf surged at her words. Approval and desperate need and something approaching worship for this small woman who had walked into his madness and offered practical solutions instead of fear or judgment. "What my wolf wants will change everything between us." "I know." Sera held his gaze without flinching. "Change it anyway. We will deal with the consequences after we survive." Permission. She was giving him permission to take the first step toward a bond that would tie their lives together in ways that could not be undone. It was madness. They barely knew each other. She was 25 to his 38. She was untrained, unawakened, completely unprepared for what claiming would mean. She was also right. His wolf would not settle until it had marked her as mate, and a functional alpha was worth whatever moral complications came later. Cade moved closer, slowly, giving her time to retreat or refuse. When she did neither, he reached out and cupped her face with one hand. Her skin was warm beneath his palm, soft. Her pulse beat rabbit-quick against his thumb where it rested on her throat. "This is your last chance to leave." His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Once I claim you, there is no going back. My wolf will consider you mine. Your bloodline will consider me yours. We will be bound whether we want it or not. Then bind us." Sera's response came without hesitation. "Because an army approaches, and we have 4 hours to become something they cannot defeat." Cade's wolf took those words as the invitation they were. The kiss was not gentle. It carried 3 months of desperate hunger and the weight of destiny finally acknowledged. When their lips met, power exploded through the chamber with enough force to crack stone walls that had stood for centuries. Sera gasped against his mouth, her hands fisted in his shirt as silver fire danced along her skin. Not metaphorical fire, actual flames of pure silver light that responded to emotion and promised destruction to anything that threatened her. Her Shadowborn nature, suppressed for 25 years, roared to life in response to an alpha's claiming touch. The bond snapped into place between them, not complete, not fully formed, but present enough to change everything. Cade could feel her emotions bleeding through the connection, fear and exhilaration and determination, could sense her consciousness brushing against his like two minds learning to occupy the same space. His wolf settled with a satisfied growl. Finally she was theirs. Finally they were whole. But there was no time to explore what they had just done. No time for the traditional rituals or the slow building of intimacy that proper mating required. Because dawn was coming, and with it an army that wanted Sera dead, and Shadow Ridge burned to ash. They broke apart, both breathing hard. Sera's eyes had changed, silver mixed with green in patterns that shifted like living things. Her scent had changed too, still wildflowers and shadow, but now underlaid with his own cedar and steel. Pack bond and mate bond beginning to merge into something unprecedented. "Can you fight like this?" Cade forced his mind back to tactical concerns. The claiming had stabilized his wolf, but it had also awakened something in Sera that neither of them understood. "I do not know." Sera looked at her hands where silver fire still flickered along her fingers. "I have never felt anything like this. It is as if I can see more than I should, as if shadows themselves are speaking to me." "Then we learn together." Cade moved back to the intelligence maps with renewed focus. If the bond worked the way ancient texts claimed, they could coordinate defense in ways that Victor would never anticipate. But it would require trust, complete, absolute trust that neither of them had earned yet. Sera joined him at the desk. When she leaned over the maps this time, their shoulders touched deliberately. The contact steadied them both. Strange how something as simple as touch could anchor two people who barely knew each other but were now bound for life. Victor will expect chaos. Cade's tactical mind engaged fully, pushing aside emotional complications to focus on pure strategy. He will expect me to either be locked away or completely unstable. Instead, we will give him precision, coordination, something he cannot predict or counter. "How?" Sera studied the enemy positions with the same intensity she had probably used during her infiltration. "We are outnumbered more than 2-1. We fight smarter, not harder." Cade traced defensive positions that would maximize their advantages, and we use the one thing Victor does not know we possess. "What is that?" "Each other." Cade met her eyes with the kind of absolute certainty that had earned him respect in the Continental Army. "The mate bond will let us coordinate in real time. If it works the way I think it does, you will be able to see the battlefield through my eyes. I will be able to feel threats through your instincts. We will not be two leaders. We will be one consciousness directing our forces with precision Victor cannot match. You are betting everything on a bond that formed 5 minutes ago." "I am betting everything on you." Cade's response came without hesitation. "You walked through my door knowing the risk, knowing I could have killed you on sight. You did it anyway because your pack needed saving. That kind of courage is worth betting on." Sera's expression softened. For a moment, the warrior's mask dropped, and he glimpsed the woman underneath. Someone who had spent her entire life being told she was broken. Someone who had just discovered she was legendary instead. "Then let us be legendary together." She straightened, and the mask returned. "Show me how we defend Shadow Ridge." They bent over the maps as moonlight painted silver patterns across ancient stone. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours to transform from strangers who had just claimed each other into partners who could coordinate an impossible defense. 4 hours to prove that sometimes the right people meeting at the right moment could change everything. Outside, Victor's forces moved through the forest with deadly purpose. 3 packs united by fear and old hatreds, converging on Shadow Ridge with overwhelming force. In 4 hours, they would attack. In 4 hours, blood would water ground that had known too much violence already. In 4 hours, the world would learn what happened when shadow met iron and refused to break. But for now, in a tower room lit by moonlight and silver fire, 2 people who should have been strangers planned their first battle as bonded mates. Neither knew if they would survive to see sunset. Neither let that uncertainty slow their preparations. Because that was what warriors did. They faced impossible odds with whatever weapons they possessed. They stood their ground when running would be smarter. They protected what mattered even when protection seemed futile. Sera Blackthorn and Cade Ironwolf had just discovered they mattered to each other in ways that transcended logic or reason. The bond between them was new, untested, formed in desperation rather than deliberate choice. It would have to be enough. Dawn was coming, and with it, everything would change. The claiming storm tore through Cade's consciousness like a hurricane that had finally found landfall after months of building over dark waters. When their lips had met, when the bond had snapped into place with the finality of a trap springing shut, he had expected completion. He had expected the desperate hunger to ease, for his wolf to settle into satisfied contentment, for the world to make sense again after 3 months of beautiful, terrible chaos. Instead, the bond opened like a door into infinity. Sera's mind brushed against his with the tentative curiosity of someone exploring a house they would now inhabit forever. He could feel her fear, bright and sharp as broken glass, could taste her determination like copper on his tongue, could sense the vast ocean of power that had been sleeping inside her, now stirring to terrible wakefulness in response to his claiming touch. Silver fire erupted across her skin in patterns that looked almost like ancient script. Shadows in the chamber moved independently of any light source, drawn to her like iron filings to a magnet. When she gasped, the sound carried harmonics that should not exist in a human throat. Her Shadowborn nature, suppressed for 25 years through her grandmother's desperate magic, was waking with the fury of something that had been imprisoned too long. Cade could feel it through the bond, not just her power awakening, but his own abilities amplifying in response. His alpha dominance, which had always been substantial but contained, suddenly expanded beyond anything he had experienced before. He could sense every wolf in Shadow Ridge's territory, could feel their locations, their emotional states, their readiness for battle. The pack bond, which normally required concentration to access in such detail, now laid itself open before him like a tactical map written in living consciousness. This was what the ancient texts had described: the synergy of Shadowborn and Alpha, two bloodlines that complemented each other with such precision that bonded pairs became forces of nature rather than individuals. Separately, they were powerful. Together, they transcended normal limitations entirely. But power without control was just destruction waiting for an excuse. Sera pulled back from the kiss, her eyes wide with something approaching terror. Silver and green swirled in her irises like oil on water, beautiful and unnatural. When she tried to speak, shadows twisted around the words, making her voice echo with supernatural resonance. "I cannot breathe, I cannot think, there is too much." Cade caught her shoulders as she swayed. The physical contact stabilized them both, the bond using touch to anchor consciousness that threatened to fragment under the weight of awakening power. Through their connection, he could feel what she felt: the sensory overload, the sudden awareness of dimensions beyond normal perception, the shadows whispering secrets in languages that predated human speech. "Focus on my voice." His own voice remained steady through sheer force of will, cultivated through a decade of military command. "Nothing else matters right now. Just my voice and your breath, in and out, steady." Sera's breathing was ragged, but she followed his instruction. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the rhythm of respiration that every soldier learned to control fear and maintain function under impossible stress. Cade kept his hands on her shoulders, kept his presence solid through the bond, an anchor point in the storm of her awakening. Slowly, incrementally, she steadied. The silver fire dancing across her skin dimmed to a faint glow. The shadows stopped their frantic movement and settled into something approaching normal behavior. Her eyes still carried that otherworldly swirl of colors, but the panic receded enough for intelligence to return. "What is happening to me?" "Your bloodline is waking." Cade kept his tone matter-of-fact, the same tone he had used to brief soldiers before operations that carried high casualty projections. "Your grandmother suppressed it to protect you. The bond with me broke those suppressions. Everything you should have been experiencing gradually over years is hitting you all at once." Sera looked at her hands where silver fire still flickered along her fingers, like static electricity made visible. Her expression carried the numb shock of someone whose entire understanding of self had just been rewritten without permission. "I can see through this darkness. Not metaphorically. I can actually see through solid shadow, as if it were transparent glass. I can feel the fortress around us, every corner, every corridor. There are guards 3 floors down. I know their names without ever having met them. How is that possible? Shadow sight. One of the Shadowborn gifts. Cade had read about it in the ancient texts he had studied during his isolation. The ability to perceive through any darkness, to use shadow as a window rather than a barrier. Combined with his alpha awareness of pack members, they now possessed battlefield intelligence capabilities that should not exist. Can you control it? Sera closed her eyes. Concentration creased her brow as she wrestled with senses that were too new, too powerful, too overwhelming. When she opened them again, the silver glow had intensified slightly, but her expression held more confidence than terror. I think so. It is like learning to see after being blind. Everything is too bright, too sharp, but I am beginning to distinguish individual elements. She paused, and her eyes snapped to the window. Victor's forces have crossed our border, 3 miles out and closing. 473 warriors, moving in coordinated assault patterns. Cade moved to the window, though his eyes could see nothing but darkness and distant forest. Can you see their specific positions? Not see. Sense. Sera joined him, and when she spoke, her voice carried the distant quality of someone perceiving things far beyond normal human range. The shadows know where they step. Every footfall creates ripples in darkness that I can read like text on a page. She pointed toward the eastern approach. Victor leads the center column personally. 200 warriors, heavy armor, moving with the kind of discipline that speaks to extensive training. This was exactly what they needed, real-time intelligence that could not be blocked, intercepted, or deceived. But only if Sera could maintain control long enough to be useful. Only if the power awakening inside her did not consume her before dawn. Cade reached out through the pack bond with deliberate focus. Lieutenant Stone, report to the tower immediately. Bring Captain Helen across with you. The mental communication felt different now, clearer, more precise. He could feel Garrett's surprise at receiving a direct psychic command, followed quickly by grim satisfaction that his alpha was finally functional again. The response came within seconds, wordless acknowledgement that carried the weight of 30 years of loyal service. Footsteps on the tower stairs, quick but not panicked, professional. Both Garrett and Helena arrived within 2 minutes, which spoke to their readiness despite the hour. They burst through the door with weapons drawn, prepared for whatever crisis had prompted the summons. Garrett Stone was 56 years old, built like a man who had spent his entire life turning his body into a weapon through discipline and repetition. His hair had gone silver years ago, but his eyes remained sharp as obsidian and twice as hard. He had served Shadow Ridge through 3 different alphas, had earned his position as second-in-command through competence rather than politics, and had probably saved Cade's life at least twice during the early days of his leadership, when grief and guilt had made him careless. Captain Helena Cross was younger, maybe 35, with the lean build of someone who lived in the air more than on the ground. She commanded Shadow Ridge's aerial reconnaissance unit, 12 warriors trained in coordinated flight patterns that could provide tactical information impossible to gather from the ground. Her reputation for precision and innovation had made her one of the most respected military leaders in the territory. Both of them froze when they saw Sera standing beside Cade at the window. The implications were obvious and immediate, unmated female in the Alpha's private chambers. The law was clear. The punishment was death. Garrett's expression cycled through shock, calculation, and reluctant acceptance in the space of 3 seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone navigating political landmines. Alpha, I presume there is an excellent explanation for this situation. 3 packs attack at dawn. Cade's response came sharp and immediate, cutting through the social complication to focus on pure tactical necessity. 400-plus warriors, coordinated assault, Victor Ashridge in command. We have approximately 3 hours to prepare an adequate defense. Helena's eyes widened fractionally. 3 hours? Our intelligence network reported nothing about mobilization. How did we miss an operation of this scale? Because I did not miss it. Sera stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing her skills were about to be tested publicly. I infiltrated Victor's War Council 4 hours ago. I have complete intelligence on their battle plan, force composition, and strategic objectives. Garrett's gaze sharpened on her with the attention of a career soldier recognizing serious competence. You are Sera Blackthorn, intelligence specialist, filed some of the best tactical analyses I have read in 30 years. Sera nodded once, acknowledging the recognition without false modesty. I am also Shadowborn. My grandmother was Elena Thornwood. Victor discovered my heritage and comes to kill me before I can awaken. The silence that followed could have smothered fire. Both Garrett and Helena stared at her with expressions that mixed disbelief with something approaching horror. Shadowborn were legends, nightmares told to young wolves to teach them about the dangers of unchecked power. The idea that one stood in front of them, alive and apparently in control, rewrote fundamental assumptions about the world. Helena found her voice first. Shadowborn died out 40 years ago. Apparently not. Sera's tone remained level despite the weight of revelation. My grandmother went into hiding after Ravencrest. She suppressed my abilities to protect me. Those suppressions broke tonight when the mate bond formed with your alpha. Garrett's attention snapped to Cade. Mate bond. The words came out flat. Dangerous. You claimed an unmated female in your chambers. I did. Cade met his second's gaze without flinching. And I will not apologize for it. The bond stabilized my wolf. It awakened her abilities. Together, we can coordinate defense in ways that Victor will never anticipate. This was not protocol. It was necessity. Necessity that violates pack law. Pack law written for normal circumstances. Cade's voice carried the absolute authority that made warriors follow orders, even when those orders led toward death. We faced genocide at dawn. I will apologize for breaking protocol after we survive to see sunset. Garrett held his gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them, understanding built through years of shared combat and mutual respect. Finally, the old warrior nodded once. Then let us ensure we survive. Show me your intelligence. They moved to the desk, where Sera's hand-drawn map still waited. As she traced enemy positions and explained Victor's three-wave strategy, both Garrett and Helena leaned in with the focused attention of people whose lives depended on understanding every detail. Cade watched his second's expression shift from skepticism to grudging respect to something approaching awe as Sera's tactical analysis revealed itself. She was brilliant, more than brilliant. Her understanding of terrain, psychology, and strategic timing was the kind of thing that could not be taught, only cultivated through years of obsessive study and practical application. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had earned her expertise through risk and repetition. The northern wall is their primary target. Sera's finger tapped the map with decisive precision. Victor knows it is our weakest defensive position. He will use the eastern assault as a feint to draw our attention while his main force breaches here and drives directly toward the fortress interior. Classic hammer and anvil. Garrett's voice carried professional appreciation. But knowing the strategy gives us options to counter it. If we reinforce the northern approach and use the eastern forces as bait instead of distraction. Sera nodded, silver flecks in her eyes catching the lamplight. Exactly. Let Victor commit to his feint. When his main force hits the northern wall, they will find it far better defended than intelligence suggested. Helena spoke up, her tactical mind already racing ahead to aerial applications. I can position my flight unit to strike Victor's rear elements once they commit. Coordinated dive patterns could eliminate their shadowcasters before they can bring their magic to bear effectively. How many shadowcasters does Victor have? Cade directed the question to Sera. 7 confirmed, all positioned with the main force for maximum effect against our defenses. She closed her eyes, and silver fire danced along her temples as she reached out with senses that transcended normal perception. I can feel them even from here. Their power is significant, but not overwhelming. They rely on prepared spells rather than spontaneous casting. Can you counter them? Sera opened her eyes, and for the first time uncertainty crossed her expression. I do not know. This power has been awake for less than an hour. I can sense potential, feel capabilities that should be possible, but I have no training, no experience. Asking me to counter trained shadowcasters is like handing someone a sword for the first time and expecting them to defeat a master. Then we do not rely on you matching their power. Cade's tactical mind engaged fully, incorporating her abilities into strategy without depending on them as the single point of failure. We use your shadow sight for intelligence and coordination. Your awakening has already given us advantages that Victor cannot predict. Asking for more would be tactical stupidity. Relief flickered across Sera's face, quickly hidden. She had been preparing to force herself into combat applications she was not ready for, driven by the same desperate courage that had brought her to his door. The fact that he did not demand more than she could safely provide seemed to ease something fundamental in her posture. Garrett pulled out a tactical slate and began sketching defensive positions with the swift efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. If we position our heavy infantry here and here, we can create overlapping fields of fire. The northern wall becomes a kill zone rather than a weak point. Helena added her own annotations. My aerial unit can coordinate with Lady Shadowborn's intelligence. If she can see enemy movements in real time, I can adjust strike patterns to hit maximum effect targets. Lady Shadowborn. The title hung in the air with weight that suggested implications Cade would need to address later. For now, he let it stand. Sera had earned recognition through competence. The politics of her status could wait until after they survived the night. They spent the next 2 hours refining strategy with the kind of obsessive detail that meant the difference between victory and massacre. Garrett would command ground forces, his 3 decades of experience making him the obvious choice for coordinating defensive positions. Helena would lead aerial strikes, her flight unit becoming mobile artillery that could respond to threats as they developed. Cade and Sera would remain in the tower, using their bond to coordinate both elements through real-time intelligence that Victor's forces could neither predict nor counter. It was ambitious, possibly insane, definitely their best chance at survival. As the eastern sky began showing the first gray promises of dawn, Garrett straightened from the maps. We are as ready as we can be with the time available. Now we wait to see if theory survives contact with reality. It never does. Cade had learned that lesson through blood during his Continental Army service. Plans fail. Soldiers die. The only constant in combat is chaos and the human capacity to adapt or perish. But planning gives us a framework to improvise from. That has to be enough. Garrett saluted with the crisp precision of a career military man for Shadow Ridge. For Shadow Ridge, Cade returned the salute, feeling the weight of command settle across his shoulders, like an old coat that fit too well and chafed in all the familiar places. Helena followed Garrett toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at Sera. Your grandmother was a terror and a legend. The old stories paint her as both monster and hero, depending on who tells them. I look forward to learning which version her granddaughter represents. Then she was gone, leaving Cade and Sera alone in the tower as dawn crept closer, and the weight of what they had initiated pressed down like atmosphere turning solid. Sera moved to the window, staring out at darkness that was slowly surrendering to gray light. Cade joined her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The physical contact steadied them both, the bond using proximity to reinforce connection that was still too new, too raw, too overwhelming. I am terrified. Sera's admission came so quietly, he almost missed it. Not of dying. I made peace with that possibility when I chose to infiltrate Victor's camp, but of failing, of getting people killed because I awakened too late to learn control, of being the weakness that breaks our defense. You are not weak. Cade kept his voice firm but not harsh. You walked through my door knowing the risk. You awakened a bloodline that has been hidden for decades. You stand here now, coordinating tactics with career soldiers who respect your analysis. That is not weakness. That is exactly the kind of strength we need. But what if I lose control? What if the power overwhelms me and I become the monster the stories describe? Then I will anchor you. The words came without hesitation. That is what the mate bond provides. Balance. You amplify my dominance. I ground your power. Together we are stable in ways that neither of us could achieve alone. Sera turned to face him fully. Silver and green swirled in her eyes like storm clouds pregnant with lightning. You put tremendous faith in a bond that formed under duress. We barely know each other. I know you were brave enough to enter a potentially feral alpha's chambers to deliver intelligence that could save your pack. I know you possess skills that required years of dangerous training to develop. I know you carry yourself with the quiet confidence of someone who has faced death and decided to document it rather than flee. That is enough to build on. What if it is not? Then we fail together. Cade reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm beneath his palm, and where they touched, silver and gold light mingled in patterns that looked almost like ancient writing. But we do not fail alone. and we do not surrender without making Victor regret every step that brought him to our gates." Sera's fingers tightened around his. For a moment, vulnerability crossed her expression. The warrior's mask dropped, and he glimpsed the woman who had spent 25 years believing she was broken, who had just discovered she was legendary instead, who faced the future with courage born from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. "Then what are we waiting for?" Her voice steadied, sharpening into something that carried edges. "Let us show Victor what happens when he threatens the wrong pack." The bond pulsed between them, not complete, not fully formed, but present enough to change everything. Through it, Cade could feel Sera's determination crystallizing into something harder than diamond, could sense her fear transforming into fuel rather than paralysis, could recognize the same desperate courage that had driven him through impossible missions during his military service. They turned as one to face the window. Beyond the glass, the forest waited in that strange gray light that preceded true dawn. Somewhere in that darkness, 400 warriors moved with deadly purpose toward Shadow Ridge's walls. Victor Ashridge led them, driven by 40 years of trauma and genocidal conviction. He expected to find a pack in chaos, an alpha too unstable to lead, defenses unprepared for coordinated assault. Instead, he would find something unprecedented. Two people who had just discovered they were stronger together than either could be alone. A bond that should not exist, awakened in desperation and forged through necessity. Power that legends warned about, now channeled through tactical precision rather than mindless destruction. Victor was about to learn what happened when shadow met iron and refused to break. Dawn broke across Shadow Ridge like a blade drawn from its sheath. The first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson that poets would have called beautiful if those same colors had not signaled the beginning of slaughter. Cade felt the moment through the pack bond with crystalline clarity. Every warrior snapping to full alert, every defensive position locked and ready, every heart beating faster as adrenaline flooded systems designed by evolution to either fight or flee. Shadow Ridge chose to fight. Through Sera's shadow sight, Cade could see Victor's forces as clearly as if he stood among them. The eastern assault force broke from the tree line first, 200 warriors charging toward the wall with the disciplined fury of soldiers who had trained together for months. They moved in coordinated waves, shield bearers in front, ranged attackers behind, magical support providing cover fire that lit up the dawn with colors no sunrise should contain. It was beautiful in the way that catastrophes often are, terrible and magnificent and completely unstoppable. Or it would have been unstoppable if Shadow Ridge had positioned their forces where Victor expected. "Eastern wall, stand ready." Cade's command flowed through the pack bond with surgical precision. "Hold until they commit fully, no early engagement." On the ground 300 yards away, Garrett received the order and held his position despite every instinct screaming to meet the charge. 40 warriors crouched behind defensive positions that looked hastily prepared but had actually been reinforced overnight with brutal efficiency. They watched 200 enemies close the distance, watched magical fire arc toward their positions, watched death approach with the inevitability of sunrise. Garrett did not give the order to engage. He trusted his alpha, had trusted him through 3 years of leadership, and would trust him now even as enemies closed to lethal range. Now, Cade's command came sharp and immediate. "Shadow barriers." Sera's eyes flared silver. Power poured from her in waves that Cade could feel through the bond like heat from a forge. Shadows erupted from the ground itself, forming walls of solidified darkness that absorbed magical attacks with the casual ease of stone drinking water. Victor's carefully prepared assault spells splashed against shadow barriers and dissipated into nothing. The eastern force faltered. Confusion rippled through their ranks as their primary weapons proved useless. In that moment of hesitation, Garrett gave the order his warriors had been waiting for. "Archers loose." 60 arrows launched from concealed positions. Not a volley designed for maximum casualties, but precision strikes targeting specific individuals that Sera had identified through shadow sight. Shadowcasters, their leaders, anyone whose death would cascade through enemy formations and transform coordinated assault into chaos. 16 enemies fell in the first barrage, not enough to break the charge, but enough to wound it, enough to plant doubt, enough to make the Eastern force question whether they were the hammer or the nail. They pressed forward anyway, because warriors did not retreat from initial contact without orders. But their momentum was broken, their confidence shaken, and momentum and confidence were often worth more than raw numbers when combat turned close and personal. Through the bond, Cade felt Sera's strain. Maintaining shadow barriers across 300 yards while simultaneously tracking enemy positions was burning through her newly awakened power at unsustainable rates. She was like someone trying to sprint a marathon, capable of the speed but lacking the endurance to maintain it. "Sera, ease back. You are burning too hot too fast. I can hold it." Her mental voice carried strain that physical words would have hidden. "They need these barriers. They need you functional in an hour more than they need barriers now." Cade kept his tone firm. "Let the barriers fade. Garrett can handle conventional assault." Resistance flickered through the bond, the kind of stubborn determination that came from someone who had spent their entire life trying to prove they were not defective. Sera wanted to be useful, wanted to justify her existence, wanted to demonstrate that awakening her power was worth the risk Cade had taken. He understood the impulse, had felt it himself countless times during his military service. The need to be worthy of the trust others placed in you. The desperate desire to prove that sacrifices made on your behalf were not wasted. It was also the kind of thinking that got people killed. You are already worthy. Cade pushed the thought through the bond with all the conviction he possessed. "Conserve your strength. We have hours of combat ahead, and I need you functional for all of them." Finally, reluctantly, the shadow barriers began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but thinning enough that maintaining them no longer required Sera's complete focus. Cade felt her exhaustion through the bond, bone-deep weariness that came from pushing newly awakened abilities far beyond their safe limits. "The eastern wall is holding." Garrett's report came through the pack bond with grim satisfaction. 17 enemy casualties, minor damage to our positions, enemy morale noticeably degraded. Maintain defensive posture. Do not pursue. Cade kept his commands crisp and clear. Let them come to you. Every step they take toward our walls is a step away from their support elements. Understood, Alpha. The northern force would be moving now. Victor was not stupid. He had seen his eastern assault falter, had watched his shadowcasters fall to precision archery, had realized that something was deeply wrong with his intelligence about Shadow Ridge's capabilities. Any competent commander would recognize the eastern assault as the feint it had been designed to be and commit to the northern breach with overwhelming force. Through Sera's shadow sight, Cade watched Victor do exactly that. 270 warriors surged toward Shadow Ridge's northern wall with the kind of desperate urgency that came from recognizing your battle plan was unraveling. Victor led them personally, a massive figure even among warriors bred for size and strength. His power radiated through shadow sight like heat shimmer, marking him as an alpha of significant capability and decades of experience. He would hit the northern wall like a tactical sledgehammer, would expect it to crumble, would anticipate the kind of breakthrough that let attacking forces pour into the fortress interior and transform siege into slaughter. Instead, he found hell waiting for him with professional precision and cold mathematical fury. The northern wall had been reinforced overnight, not obviously, not in ways that aerial reconnaissance would notice, but every weak point had been shored up, every defensive position had been optimized. Overlapping fields of fire had been calculated with the kind of brutal efficiency that came from career soldiers who understood that warfare was applied mathematics written in blood. Garrett commanded this defense personally. 60 warriors, heavy infantry, positioned in layers that would force any breach to fight for every yard. He watched Victor's force charge through shadow sight that Cade shared through the pack bond, watched 270 enemies close to engagement range, watched his own warriors settle into the kind of cold readiness that separated veterans from recruits. "Hold!" Garrett's voice carried the absolute calm of someone who had stood in this exact position 100 times before. "Steady. Hold." The first wave hit the northern wall like a physical impact that Cade felt through the pack bond. Warriors slammed against stone and steel. Claws scrabbled for purchase. Magic lit up the early morning with colors that would have been beautiful if they had not been designed to kill. Garrett's warriors held, not through superior strength or magical advantage, but through pure tactical positioning and the kind of disciplined violence that came from endless training. They fought like a machine, every movement calculated, every strike designed for maximum efficiency, no wasted motion, no individual heroics, just the terrible mathematics of organized murder. Victor's forces were brave, capable, well-trained, but they were attacking prepared positions defended by warriors who knew every inch of the terrain and had been given perfect intelligence about where to expect assault. The mathematics did not favor attackers. Cade watched casualty counts climb through the pack bond with the detached awareness of someone who had done this calculus too many times. His warriors were holding, but at a cost. Every minute of combat meant injuries, meant warriors falling back, meant the slow erosion of defensive capability that would eventually reach a tipping point where numbers and momentum overwhelmed skill and position. They needed to change the equation before that tipping point arrived. Helena, execute aerial strike pattern Delta 7. The response came immediate and eager. Captain Helena Cross had been waiting for this order. Her flight unit, 12 warriors who had spent years perfecting coordinated aerial combat, launched from hidden positions throughout the fortress. They hit Victor's rear elements with the kind of surgical precision that modern military forces would recognize as close air support. Diving attacks that targeted shadowcasters and commanders, disrupting formations, creating chaos in what should have been ordered assault. 4 shadowcasters fell in the first 30 seconds. Their prepared spells died with them, leaving gaps in magical support that rippled through Victor's entire force. The northern assault faltered, not breaking, not retreating, but stumbling, hesitating, losing the momentum that made frontal assault possible. Through Sera's shadow sight, Cade saw Victor's expression, rage and disbelief mixing in equal measure. The enemy Alpha had expected easy victory, had anticipated that overwhelming force against an unstable pack would result in quick conquest. Instead, his carefully planned assault was turning into a grinding slog where every yard cost blood he could not afford to spend. Victor roared commands that Cade could not hear, but could see through their effect. Warriors regrouped. Fresh forces pushed forward. The assault on the northern wall intensified as Victor committed reserves he had meant to hold for exploitation after breakthrough. It was the decision of someone who had just realized his battle plan was failing and had chosen to double down rather than withdraw and reassess. Some commanders recognized when to cut losses. Others believed that enough violence applied with sufficient conviction could overcome any obstacle. Victor was clearly the latter type. The northern wall is under extreme pressure. Garrett's report came through with strain evident even in mental communication. We can hold, but casualties are mounting. 17 wounded, 4 critical. 4 critical meant 4 warriors who would not survive without immediate medical attention. 4 people Cade had sworn to protect. 4 lives that would weigh on his conscience alongside the names already carved into his soul. Medical teams to the northern wall, priority evacuation. Cade's orders flowed with the mechanical precision of someone forcing themselves not to feel. Garrett, fall back to secondary positions. Trade space for time. Negative, Alpha. If we fall back, they breach the wall. Then let them breach. Cade kept his voice level despite the ice forming in his chest. The wall is not what we are defending. Draw them into the interior where your tactical advantages multiply. Understanding flickered through the pack bond. Garrett had not survived 30 years of combat by being inflexible. If his Alpha ordered withdrawal, there was strategy behind it. Falling back to secondary defensive line. Garrett's acknowledgement came with grim professionalism. We will make them pay for every step. On the northern wall, Shadow Ridge warriors executed a fighting withdrawal with the kind of disciplined precision that only came from extensive training. They fell back through prepared positions, each one designed to slow pursuers and multiply defensive effectiveness. They made Victor's forces earn every yard with blood and time. And Victor's forces came, poured through the breach like water through a broken dam, seeing the withdrawal as victory rather than strategy, committing fully to interior assault when they should have paused to consolidate and assess. Through Sera's shadow sight, Cade watched the enemy formation stretch, watched cohesion degrade as some warriors pushed deeper while others paused to secure captured positions, watched the kind of disorganization that transformed an army into a target. Helena, second wave. Hit their forward elements, separate the head from the body. With pleasure, Alpha. Helena's flight unit dove again, this time targeting the warriors who had pushed deepest into the fortress, creating a kill zone between Victor's forward assault and his supporting elements. Warriors who had thought they were exploiting victory suddenly found themselves cut off and surrounded. The battle's character changed in that moment. What had been organized assault dissolved into pockets of desperate combat. Victor's warriors fought with the fury of soldiers who had just realized they were trapped. Shadow Ridge defenders pressed the advantage with cold efficiency. Casualties mounted on both sides. The mathematics of violence played out with terrible inevitability. But now the equation favored defenders. Every minute of combat weakened Victor's position. Every warrior who fell left his forces more isolated and vulnerable. Through the pack bond, Cade felt his own warriors, felt their exhaustion, their fear, their wounds, felt the weight of command pressing down as he made decisions that kept some alive at the cost of others. This was why he had tried to refuse the Alpha Mantle. This burden of choosing who lived and who died, this terrible responsibility of leadership that required you to value lives differently based on tactical necessity rather than human worth. But duty was not optional, neither was the cost that came with it. Sera's presence in his mind provided unexpected stability. She did not try to ease the burden or offer false comfort. She simply existed beside him, solid and real, sharing the weight without trying to diminish it. Her newly awakened power flowed through the bond, not overwhelming but supporting, amplifying his awareness, sharpening his tactical clarity. Together they were more than the sum of their parts, and maybe that would be enough. The battleground toward its conclusion with the inevitability of sunrise. Victor's forces, recognizing their assault had failed, began withdrawing in increasingly desperate formations. Helena's aerial unit harassed their retreat without mercy. Garrett's ground forces held their positions and let the enemy flee rather than pursue and overextend. By the time full morning arrived, Victor's grand assault had collapsed into survival retreat. 312 warriors had attacked Shadow Ridge's walls. 174 withdrew alive. The rest littered the battlefield in patterns that told stories of violence and sacrifice and the terrible cost of miscalculation. Shadow Ridge had held. The price had been 43 wounded, 14 critical, and 11 dead. 11 names that Cade would carry forever alongside all the others. 11 people who had trusted his leadership right up until the moment that leadership could not save them. Victory, but victory that tasted like ash and left shadows that would never fade. Cade stood at the tower window as the sun climbed higher and painted the battlefield in light that was too cheerful for what it illuminated. Beside him, Sera swayed with exhaustion. Her power had burned through reserves that newly awakened abilities should not possess. She had given everything and somehow found more to give. When she collapsed, Cade caught her before she hit the floor, held her as consciousness fled and exhaustion claimed her with the finality of gravity. Through the bond, he could feel her still alive, still present, but so deeply asleep that nothing short of disaster would wake her. He carried her to his bed, laid her down with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence they had just orchestrated, covered her with blankets that smelled of cedar and old leather, watched silver fire dance faintly along her skin even in sleep, her shadowborn nature restless and burning despite her body's desperate need for rest. Then Cade turned and descended the tower to face what came after victory, the wounded who needed his presence, the dead who deserved his witness, the pack who had trusted him and paid various prices for that trust. Leadership was not glorious. It was not satisfaction or triumph or the clean resolution that stories promised. It was standing among bodies and telling yourself that the cost was justified, that the alternative would have been worse, that sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. Garrett met him in the courtyard. The old warrior looked like he had aged a decade in the past few hours. Blood stained his armor. Exhaustion carved deep lines around his eyes. But he stood straight and saluted with the precision of a career soldier who would maintain standards even when everything else fell apart. Casualties? Cade forced himself to ask the question, despite already knowing the answer through the pack bond. 11 dead, 14 critical, but healers believe they will survive with time. 43 wounded but functional. Garrett paused, and something flickered across his expression. Your tactics saved hundreds of lives, Alpha. Without the coordination you and Lady Shadowborn provided, we would have been slaughtered. We still lost 11 warriors. We lost 11 instead of 200. That is the definition of victory when facing impossible odds. The words should have provided comfort, should have eased the guilt that wrapped around Cade's chest like wire pulled tight. Instead, they just sat there, true but hollow. What are your orders, Alpha? Secure the perimeter, treat the wounded, honor the dead. Cade delivered the commands with mechanical precision, and prepare for potential second assault. Victor withdrew, but he is not defeated. Wounded pride is often more dangerous than tactical ambition. Garrett nodded and moved to execute orders with the efficiency of someone grateful for concrete tasks. Cade remained in the courtyard, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, watching his pack begin the long process of cleaning up after survival. Somewhere beyond Shadow Ridge's borders, Victor Ashridge gathered the remnants of his broken assault force and wrestled with 40 years of certainty crumbling in a single morning. His war was not over. This had been the first battle, not the final one. And in the tower above, Sera Blackthorn slept the sleep of someone who had given everything and found depths of strength they had not known existed. Her power had awakened. The mate bond had formed. Nothing would ever be the same. Dawn had come to Shadow Ridge, bringing victory and death in equal measure. The price had been paid in blood. The question now was whether that price had bought anything more than temporary survival. Only time would tell if what they had begun would lead to triumph or tragedy. All Cade knew for certain was that he and Sera were bound now, partners in ways that transcended choice, connected by destiny and desperation, and the simple fact that they had faced impossible odds and somehow remained standing. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and dangerous, and filled with threats they had only begun to understand. But they would face it together, for better or worse, for triumph or tragedy. Together, until the very end. Sera woke to darkness that was not darkness at all. Her eyes opened on shadows that whispered secrets in languages older than human speech. Every corner of the chamber revealed itself through her shadow sight with clarity that made normal vision seem like blindness by comparison. She could see through the stone walls into adjacent corridors, could sense the guards 3 floors below, their heartbeats visible as pulses of warmth against the cool backdrop of ancient fortress architecture, could feel the entire territory spread out before her awareness like a living map drawn in consciousness and blood. The power that had erupted during battle now hummed through her veins with the steady rhythm of something that had found its proper home. Not the chaotic explosion of awakening, but the controlled burn of abilities that were beginning to understand their own nature. Her grandmother's suppressions had shattered completely. What remained was pure Shadowborn heritage, no longer fighting to emerge but simply existing as fundamental truth. Sera sat up slowly, testing her body for damage. Exhaustion lingered like bruises that had not yet faded, but nothing felt broken or torn beyond repair. She had burned through reserves she had not known existed, had pushed newly awakened power far past safe limits, and had somehow survived the experience without destroying herself or everyone around her. That seemed like progress worth acknowledging. The chamber was Cade's. She recognized it from the scent that permeated everything, cedar and steel, and something uniquely him that made her wolf stir with contentment even in the middle of processing everything that had changed. The mate bond thrummed between them, present even when he was not physically here. She could feel him somewhere below, could sense his emotional state through connection that transcended physical proximity. Grief, exhaustion, the crushing weight of command decisions that had cost lives. Cade was mourning the 11 warriors who had fallen under his orders, carrying their names alongside all the others he had collected through years of military service and leadership. Sera swung her legs off the bed and stood on floor that felt more solid than it should, given how depleted she was. Her body moved with confidence her mind did not entirely feel. Some part of her Shadowborn nature had taken over basic functions while consciousness slept, had decided that survival required mobility regardless of how tired she felt. She found her boots beside the bed, placed there with care by someone who had carried her unconscious body and still thought about practical details like footwear. The gesture touched something in her chest that had nothing to do with supernatural bonds or tactical necessity. It spoke to consideration, to someone seeing her as a person rather than just an awakened bloodline or a strategic asset. The tower stairs descended through stone that had stood for 3 centuries. Sera moved down them with the unconscious grace of someone whose body had been trained through years of intelligence work to move efficiently regardless of circumstances. Her shadow sight showed her every step before her feet found them, showed her the guards she passed, and the way they stiffened at her presence. Word had spread. Of course it had. An unmated female spending the night in the Alpha's chambers, a Shadowborn awakening during battle, power that had turned the tide against overwhelming odds. By now, every wolf in Shadow Ridge would know what she was, what she represented, what implications her existence carried for pack hierarchy and political stability. Sera found Cade in the courtyard where warriors were arranging bodies with the kind of gentle precision that spoke to respect for the dead. 11 forms laid out in careful rows, covered with pack colors, waiting for the funeral rites that would release their spirits and honor their sacrifice. Around them, the wounded rested in makeshift medical areas, while healers moved between them with calm efficiency born from too much practice. The aftermath of battle looked nothing like the recruitment stories suggested. There was no glory here, no triumphant celebration of victory, just exhaustion and pain and the quiet grief of people who had survived when others had not. Cade stood at the head of the fallen, his posture rigid with the kind of control that came from forcing yourself not to break in public. Sera could feel him through the bond, could sense the guilt tearing at him from the inside, the names cycling through his thoughts in endless repetition, the question that all commanders asked and could never satisfactorily answer. Could I have done something different that would have saved them? She approached quietly, not wanting to intrude on private grief, but unable to stay away when the bond pulled at her with the urgency of someone drowning and reaching for air. When she reached his side, she did not speak, did not offer platitudes that would ring hollow, simply stood beside him and let the bond carry what words could not. Cade's awareness of her presence came through their connection, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Not happiness exactly, but relief. The knowledge that he was not alone in this moment, that someone stood witness to his grief who understood the cost of the victory they had won. You should be resting. His mental voice carried concern that his physical voice would have hidden behind command authority. I rested enough. Sera kept her response simple, and you should not carry this alone. 11 names. Cade's thoughts bled through the bond before he could contain them. Marcus Chen died defending the northern wall. Sera Rodriguez fell to shadow magic during the initial assault. Thomas Whitfield bled out before healers could reach him. 11 people who trusted me. 11 families who will receive bodies instead of warriors coming home. They trusted you, and you gave them the best chance at survival possible. Sera chose her words with the care of someone who understood that grief was not rational and could not be argued away. Without the coordination we provided, casualties would have been catastrophic. You saved hundreds of lives by spending 11. The guilt in his thoughts felt like broken glass. What kind of mathematics turns people into acceptable losses? The kind that every commander throughout history has had to calculate. Sera turned to face him fully, forcing him to meet her eyes. I watched my father make those decisions, watched him carry the weight of choices where every option cost lives, and the only question was how many. It never got easier. He never stopped questioning himself, but he also never stopped leading, because good people needed someone willing to bear that burden. Your father was a remarkable man. He was human. Sera let that truth sit between them. No supernatural abilities, no pack bond to lean on. Just a man who decided that protecting others was worth the cost to himself. You have advantages he never possessed. Use them. Through the bond, she felt Cade processing her words, felt him wrestling with guilt that would never fully disappear, but might become bearable with time and support. The mate bond was supposed to provide balance. She was beginning to understand that balance did not mean eliminating pain, but sharing it so neither person carried the full weight alone. Lieutenant Stone approached with the cautious respect of someone interrupting private grief. His armor still showed bloodstains that spoke to how recently he had left the battlefield. Exhaustion carved deep lines around his eyes, but his posture remained military precise. Alpha, Lady Shadowborn. The bodies have been prepared for funeral rites. The pack gathers at sunset to honor the fallen. Cade nodded once, sharp and controlled. I will speak at the ceremony. Every warrior deserves to be remembered by name. Garrett's expression flickered with something that might have been approval or concern, or both. The wounded are stable. Healers report that all 14 critical cases will survive with time and care. 43 others suffered various injuries but remain functional. What are our defensive capabilities if Victor attacks again? Honestly, Garrett's bluntness was characteristic. We could hold against harassment, but not another full assault. Our warriors are exhausted. Supplies are depleted. Morale is good but fragile. We need time to recover before we can face another major engagement. Then we buy time. Cade's tactical mind engaged despite the grief, because duty did not pause for mourning. Strengthen perimeter defenses. Rotate rest schedules to keep warriors functional. Send emissaries to neighboring packs requesting support under mutual defense treaties. Already initiated. Garrett hesitated, and his attention shifted to Sera. Lady Shadowborn, your abilities turned the tide of battle, but they also revealed your existence to every warrior who survived. Word will spread. The Continental Council will demand answers. Let them demand. Sera kept her voice level despite the ice forming in her chest. I am not hiding anymore. My grandmother spent decades in fear, suppressing what I was to protect me from people like Victor. That protection died the moment I awakened. Now we deal with the consequences. The consequences could include political trials and execution orders. Garrett spoke with the bluntness of someone who had seen enough politics to recognize danger. Shadowborn are legends and nightmares. Most packs will not distinguish between the two. Then we teach them the difference. Cade's response carried absolute certainty. Sera used her power to defend our pack, to coordinate tactics that saved lives. Anyone who sees that as a threat is the actual danger. Garrett studied them both for a long moment. Something passed across his expression that suggested he was reassessing assumptions he had held for decades. Finally, he nodded. The pack stands with you, both of you. What you accomplished during battle earned loyalty that politics cannot easily break, but you should prepare for challenges from outside our territory. We will face them as they come. Cade's tone suggested the discussion was finished. Right now, we honor our dead and care for our wounded. Everything else is secondary. Garrett saluted and withdrew to continue coordinating recovery efforts. Sera watched him go with the analytical part of her mind that never fully turned off. The old warrior had accepted her presence without the hesitation or fear she had expected. That spoke to either tremendous trust in his alpha or recognition that practical necessity outweighed social convention. Probably both. The hours until sunset passed with the strange compression of time that followed major trauma. Sera helped where she could, using her shadow sight to locate supply caches that had been buried or hidden during battle preparation. Her presence among the wounded created ripples of reaction. Some warriors looked at her with awe, others with barely concealed fear. A few with the calculating assessment of people who were reserving judgment until they had more information. She met every gaze with steady calm, refusing to apologize for existing or for the power that hummed through her veins. Her grandmother had hidden in fear. Sera would not repeat that mistake. If her bloodline made people uncomfortable, they would have to learn to live with discomfort. Captain Helena Cross found her in the medical area, helping healers organize supplies. The aerial commander moved with the controlled exhaustion of someone running on willpower and muscle memory. Blood spattered her flight leathers, though whether it was her own or someone else's remained unclear. Lady Shadowborn. Helena's greeting carried professional respect rather than social warmth. A word, if you have a moment. Sera followed her to a quiet corner where their conversation would not be overheard. Helena studied her with eyes that had seen decades of combat and learned to assess threats with brutal efficiency. My flight unit coordinated strikes based on intelligence you provided. Your shadow sight gave us targeting information that should not be possible. We eliminated threats before they could threaten us. She paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. I have fought beside alphas and warriors and tactical geniuses. None of them could do what you did. That makes you either our greatest asset or our most dangerous liability. Which do you think I am? I think you are someone who walked into an alpha's chambers knowing the risk, awakened a bloodline that was supposed to be extinct, and used that power to save lives instead of taking them. Helena's expression remained neutral, but her tone carried weight. I also think you are untrained, exhausted, and operating on instincts you do not fully understand. That combination will eventually create a crisis. So what do you suggest? Training, structure, understanding what you can safely do versus what will burn you out or hurt people around you. Helena glanced toward where Cade stood organizing funeral preparations. Your alpha needs you functional. The pack needs you reliable. That requires more than good intentions and raw power. Are you offering to help? I am offering to not stand in your way when you make mistakes. Actual help requires trust we have not earned from each other yet. Helena's bluntness was refreshing after hours of people speaking in diplomatic circles. But I will say this. You fought well during your first battle. Most newly awakened bloodlines lose control and become threats to both sides. You maintain discipline. That is worth acknowledging. The words settled between them. Not quite approval, but something closer to professional respect. Sera recognized the gesture for what it was. An experienced warrior extending conditional acceptance to someone who had proven basic competence under fire. Thank you, Captain. I will try not to make you regret that assessment. Helena's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement. You will make me regret it eventually. Everyone does. The question is whether the regret comes from honest mistakes or reckless stupidity. Try to keep it in the first category. Then she was gone, leaving Sera alone with thoughts that refused to settle into any comfortable pattern. The political implications of her existence were becoming clearer with each interaction. She was powerful, unprecedented, exactly the kind of wild card that stable hierarchies feared and tried to control or eliminate. Shadow Ridge would protect her because Cade would demand it, and the pack bond would enforce loyalty. But beyond their borders, every territory would be calculating threats and opportunities. Some would seek alliance, others would seek her death. Most would simply try to use her for their own purposes. Sera had spent 25 years being invisible, learning to move through spaces without drawing attention, perfecting the art of gathering intelligence while remaining unremarkable. Those skills would no longer serve her. Shadowborn could not be invisible. The power burned too bright to hide. She would have to learn entirely new ways of navigating the world and hope that lessons came fast enough to keep her alive. Sunset arrived with the inevitability of tides. The pack gathered in the courtyard where 11 bodies waited for the fire that would release their spirits. Warriors stood in formation, exhaustion temporarily set aside in favor of the discipline that ritual required. Healers supported wounded who insisted on attending despite injuries that should have kept them bedridden. Even those too injured to stand watched from windows and doorways, bearing witness to sacrifice that had purchased their survival. Cade stood before the assembled pack with the bearing of someone who had done this too many times. Sera remained at his side, not because protocol demanded it, but because the bond would not let her be anywhere else. Through their connection, she felt his grief and determination mixing into something that resembled acceptance, without quite achieving it. We gather to honor those who fell defending our home. Cade's voice carried across the courtyard with the projection that years of military command had perfected. 11 warriors gave their lives so that hundreds might survive. They trusted their alpha to lead them well. They followed orders that took them into danger. They did not hesitate when duty called. He named each fallen warrior, spoke their ranks, their ages, their accomplishments, detailed how they had died and what their sacrifice had achieved, made certain that every person listening understood these were not abstract casualties, but individuals with families and futures that had been cut short. Sera felt his pain through the bond as he spoke each name, felt the weight of command crushing down on him with renewed force, felt him questioning every decision that had led to this moment and finding no answers that eased the burden. When he finished speaking, fire claimed the bodies. Traditional werewolf cremation, fast and hot, returning flesh to ash and spirit to whatever waited beyond. The pack howled their grief and respect, voices joining in harmonics that transcended individual pain to become collective mourning. Sera howled with them. Her voice carried silver harmonics that marked her as other, as different, as something that did not quite fit into normal pack dynamics. But she howled anyway, because these warriors had died defending a territory that included her. had followed orders from an alpha who was now bound to her, had earned remembrance regardless of whether she fully belonged among them. The ceremony concluded as sunset faded into dusk. Warriors dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave but recognizing that grief required privacy as much as community. Cade remained standing before the pyres until only ash remained. Sera stayed beside him, silent support that asked nothing and offered everything. Finally, when full darkness had arrived and the courtyard had emptied, Cade spoke aloud for the first time since the ceremony ended. "I should feel satisfied. We won. Shadow Ridge stands. The casualties could have been catastrophic, but were merely terrible instead. By every tactical measure, this was a successful defense. But you do not feel satisfied." Sera finished the thought he could not quite voice. "I feel like I spent lives to buy time. Like every victory is just delaying inevitable defeat. Like the weight of all these names is going to crush me before I find whatever peace looks like." His voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something approaching spiritual depletion. Sera reached out and took his hand. The contact anchored them both through the bond, providing stability that neither could achieve alone. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "You are not alone in carrying this weight. That is what the mate bond provides. You amplify my power. I ground your burden. Together we are balanced in ways that neither of us could be separately." "I have been alone for so long." Cade's admission came raw and unfiltered. "Since my squad died, since I took the alpha mantle, even surrounded by hundreds of pack members, I was isolated by the decisions only I could make, the responsibility only I could bear. And now you are bonded to someone who understands sacrifice and duty and the cost of protecting others." Sera squeezed his hand. "I cannot eliminate your grief, cannot make the names weigh less, but I can stand beside you while you carry them, can remind you that leadership is not supposed to be bearable alone." Through the bond, she felt something shift in him. Not healing, that would take time measured in months or years, but recognition. The beginning of acceptance that maybe vulnerability was not weakness, that maybe sharing burden was not abdication of responsibility. They stood together in the darkness as ash cooled and stars emerged overhead. Two people who had been strangers 5 days ago, now bound by destiny and choice, and the simple fact that they had faced impossible circumstances and somehow remained standing. 3 days passed in the strange compression of time that followed major trauma. Warriors healed. Defenses were reinforced. Emissaries arrived from neighboring packs, some offering genuine support, others clearly gathering intelligence about the Shadowborn who had emerged during battle. Sera met with each delegation alongside Cade, presenting a united front that made clear her status was not temporary or apologetic. She was Lady Shadowborn of Shadow Ridge, bonded to their alpha, and would be treated with the respect that position commanded. Most delegations handled the situation with diplomatic grace. A few barely concealed their horror at discovering a supposedly extinct bloodline walking among them. One envoy from a particularly conservative pack actually suggested that Sera should be contained for public safety. Cade's response had been concise and carried the kind of cold fury that made seasoned warriors reconsider their life choices. She saved hundreds of lives through her coordination during battle. If you interpret defense of her pack as a threat requiring containment, perhaps you should examine whether your definition of safety is actually just another word for control through fear. The envoy had withdrawn shortly after, and no further suggestions of containment had been voiced publicly. On the 4th day after battle, a summons arrived from the Continental Council, formal, official, carrying the weight of political authority that governed relations between territorial packs. Alpha Cade Ironwolf and the Shadowborn, known as Sera Blackthorn, were commanded to appear before the 12-member council to provide testimony regarding recent events and address concerns about supernatural power consolidation. Garrett read the summons with the grim expression of someone who recognized political theater designed to legitimize predetermined conclusions. They want to put you on trial, make an example, show other packs that even alphas must submit to council authority. Let them try. Cade's response carried the confidence of someone who had survived worse than political posturing. "We have nothing to hide. Sera used her abilities to defend our territory. Any attempt to criminalize self-defense reveals more about the Council's priorities than our actions. You are assuming they care about logic or justice." Garrett's tone suggested he knew better. Political trials are about control and precedent. They see a Shadowborn bonded to an Alpha and recognize a threat to the status quo. Whether that threat is real or imagined does not matter. Sera had been listening quietly, processing the implications through the analytical framework she had developed during years of intelligence work. When she spoke, her voice carried certainty that came from understanding how power actually functioned. They cannot execute me without triggering a territorial war. Shadow Ridge will not surrender their Alpha's mate to political expedience. Other packs will recognize that if the Council can demand my death today, they can demand anyone's death tomorrow. The precedent would destabilize continental politics. So they will demand something else. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Registration, oversight, some mechanism that lets them claim they are monitoring dangerous supernatural abilities while actually establishing authority to control you. Then we negotiate terms that we can live with. Sera met his gaze without flinching. I will not hide, will not pretend I am less than I am to make comfortable people feel safe. But I also will not give them ammunition to claim I am a threat. We attend their trial, we present the truth. We force them to choose between acknowledging reality or revealing their own prejudices. You make it sound simple. It is simple. The politics may be complex, but the core choice is not. They either accept that Shadowborn are not inherently evil, or they commit to genocidal policies that will fracture the Continental Alliance. Most council members are intelligent enough to recognize which option serves long-term stability. Cade's presence through the bond carried mixture of pride and concern. You are willing to walk into what might be a trap. I walked into your chambers knowing the risk. This is just another version of the same gamble. Sometimes the only way forward is through danger. The journey to the Continental Council seat took 2 days by traditional travel. The capital sat in neutral territory, built centuries ago to facilitate diplomatic relations between packs who might otherwise have been at war. Impressive architecture designed to inspire awe and remind visitors that they stood in a place where individual pack authority was subordinate to collective governance. Sera studied the massive complex with shadow sight that revealed structural details invisible to normal perception. Multiple defensive layers, guard positions optimized for both security and intimidation, architecture deliberately designed to make visitors feel small and the council feel elevated, psychological warfare through building design, subtle but effective for those who did not recognize the manipulation. Cade remained at her side as they were escorted through corridors lined with historical displays celebrating centuries of continental peace. Each display carefully curated to reinforce the narrative that council authority had prevented chaos and maintained order through wisdom and careful governance. The displays neglected to mention the numerous wars that council policies had failed to prevent, or the smaller packs that had been absorbed through political maneuvering that differed from conquest only in paperwork. History belonged to those with authority to write it. The council chamber itself was designed for intimidation. 12 elevated seats arranged in a semicircle, forcing anyone who stood before them to look up at faces positioned to suggest judgment from superior position. Gallery seating allowed witnesses and observers to watch proceedings, turning trials into public spectacle. Approximately 300 wolves filled the gallery. Some were genuine observers interested in unprecedented proceedings. Others were clearly planted to provide public reaction that council members could reference as justification for whatever verdict they had already decided. Sera and Cade stood in the center of the chamber, side by side, presenting unified front that made clear they would face judgment together. Through the bond, Sera felt his steady calm. Years of military discipline had taught him to face hostile authority with controlled professionalism that gave away nothing. She matched his composure, drawing on intelligence training that had prepared her for interrogation scenarios far more personally threatening than political theater. The council alpha who presided over proceedings was named Dominic Ravencrest. The surname made Sera's breath catch. Ravencrest was the pack that Victor's father had led before the massacre 40 years ago. This alpha was probably Victor's cousin, or some other relation who carried personal grudges wrapped in political authority. Dominic looked the part of someone born to power rather than earning it. Mid-40s, impeccably groomed, with the kind of calculated presence that came from decades of political maneuvering. His eyes held intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. Alpha Ironwolf, the Shadowborn. You stand before the Continental Council to address concerns regarding supernatural power consolidation and potential threats to territorial stability. Dominic's voice carried across the chamber with theatrical projection. Do you understand the gravity of these proceedings? We understand that you have summoned us to provide testimony regarding our defense of Shadow Ridge against unprovoked assault. Cade's response was precise and carried no hint of intimidation. We are prepared to answer questions truthfully. Your defense included deployment of Shadowborn abilities that have not been witnessed in 40 years. Dominic leaned forward slightly, a predator showing interest in prey. The last confirmed Shadowborn was Elena Thornwood, who participated in the Ravencrest massacre that killed 300 pack members. Her reappearance raises obvious concerns. I am not my grandmother. Sera kept her voice level. And characterizing Ravencrest as a massacre requires ignoring that Alpha Darius Ashridge attempted to kidnap and forcibly breed Elena. She and her mate defended themselves against slavery and sexual violence. Perhaps we should discuss why the Council considers self-defense to be a massacre when it is committed by Shadowborn but justified when committed by Alphas. The chamber erupted in noise. Some voices rose in agreement. Others shouted condemnation. Dominic allowed the chaos to continue for precisely calculated seconds before calling for order. You admit to being descended from Elena Thornwood. You admit that her bloodline has awakened in you. Yet you claim this is not a threat. I claim that my abilities were used to coordinate defense of my pack against 400 attacking warriors. I claim that my shadow sight provided intelligence that saved lives. I claim that my bond with Alpha Ironwolf created tactical capabilities that turned inevitable defeat into survival. Sera met Dominic's gaze without flinching. If you see defense as threat, that reveals your priorities far more than mine. Several council members shifted in their seats. Not all of them looked comfortable with the direction proceedings were taking. Sera recognized the political calculation playing out. Dominic was pushing for condemnation, but he needed majority vote. If enough council members recognized that criminalizing self-defense set dangerous precedent, the verdict might go differently than he intended. Alpha Ironwolf, you bonded with an unmated female in your chambers without proper courtship ritual. Dominic shifted targets. You violated pack law for personal gratification. I stabilized my wolf and gained a tactical advantage that saved my pack from annihilation. Cade's response came flat and emotionless. I violated social protocol to achieve strategic necessity. I would make the same choice again without hesitation. So you admit that personal desire outweighs pack law. I admit that survival outweighs protocol. Show me a law more important than preventing genocide, and I will apologize for breaking it. The exchange continued for hours. Dominic probed for weakness, searching for admissions that could be twisted into justification for whatever punishment he had already decided was appropriate. Cade and Sera responded with patient consistency, refusing to be provoked into emotional reactions that would undermine their position. Through the bond, Sera felt Cade's exhaustion building, felt her own energy depleting as concentration required to maintain composure began to cost more than it should, but they held their ground because yielding even slightly would be interpreted as guilt. Finally, after what felt like endless interrogation, Dominic called for council vote. The question before us is whether the Continental Council should recognize Shadowborn bloodlines as legitimate members of Pact Society or classify them as supernatural threats requiring oversight and potential containment. Each council member will cast their vote publicly. The votes came in sequence. 7 members voted for recognition. 4 voted for classification as threats. 1 abstained, citing need for further information. 7-4. Shadowborn were officially recognized as legitimate. It was not overwhelming victory, but it was victory nonetheless. Dominic's expression suggested he had been expecting closer vote or different outcome. He recovered quickly, political instincts smoothing over disappointment. The Council recognizes Shadowborn bloodlines as legitimate. However, given the unprecedented nature of these abilities, we require registration and periodic assessment to ensure public safety. All Shadowborn must submit to Council evaluation every 6 months. Sera considered the demand. Registration was surveillance. Assessment was mechanism for control. But it was also acknowledgement that she would be allowed to exist openly rather than hiding or facing execution. Sometimes compromise was just another word for buying time to build stronger position. I will register, but assessment will be mutual. If the Council evaluates my abilities, I evaluate their oversight protocols. Transparency works in both directions, or it is just another form of oppression disguised as safety. Dominic's eyes narrowed. You are in no position to demand terms. I am in the position of someone who saved hundreds of lives and faces a council trying to criminalize that achievement. Sera kept her voice steady. You want oversight? Provide it through mechanisms that do not simply recreate the control structures that led to 40 years of Shadowborn hiding in fear. Otherwise, you are just proving that council authority is more important than justice. Several council members exchanged glances. The abstaining member leaned forward with interest that suggested Sera's words had resonated. After brief consultation, Dominic spoke again. The council accepts reciprocal transparency. Registration and assessment will include public documentation of procedures and criteria. Does this satisfy your concerns? It satisfies the minimum requirements for me to participate in good faith. Then this proceeding is concluded. You are free to return to Shadow Ridge. The Council will monitor your activities and reserves the right to intervene if credible threats emerge. They were dismissed with the kind of abrupt transition that suggested Dominic wanted them gone before they could further undermine his authority. Sera and Cade withdrew from the chamber with measured dignity, refusing to show relief or satisfaction that might be interpreted as weakness. Only when they had left the capital entirely and were traveling back toward Shadow Ridge did Sera allow herself to acknowledge what they had achieved. We won. We survived. Cade's correction came gentle. Winning implies we gained something beyond being allowed to continue existing. We gained recognition, legitimacy. The Council could have ordered my execution or demanded I submit to containment. Instead, they acknowledged Shadowborn rights. That is more than survival. For now. His concern bled through the bond. Dominic is Victor's cousin. That vote was closer than it should have been. 4 council members voted to classify you as a threat. Those 4 will work to undermine today's outcome. Then we build support among the 7 who voted correctly, strengthen alliances with progressive pacts, demonstrate that Shadowborn are assets rather than dangers. Sera's tactical mind was already working through political strategy. This is just the opening move. The real work begins now. That will take time. Then we have time to work with. For now, we return home, recover, prepare for what comes next. They traveled in comfortable silence, the bond between them providing connection that did not require words. Sera found herself reflecting on how much had changed in mere days. She had gone from invisible intelligence specialist to publicly recognized Shadowborn, had awakened abilities that reshaped her understanding of what was possible, had bonded with an alpha who treated her as partner rather than possession. The future remained uncertain. Dominic would continue pushing for restrictions. Conservative pacts would resist Shadowborn integration. Political complications would multiply as word spread and other dormant bloodlines potentially awakened. But uncertainty was familiar territory. Sera had spent her career operating in spaces where information was incomplete and outcomes were unpredictable. This was just another mission with higher stakes and more personal investment. Shadow Ridge appeared on the horizon as sunset painted the sky in colors that reminded Sera of the funeral pyres from days ago. The fortress stood solid and ancient, walls scarred by recent battle but unbroken. Warriors patrolled defensive positions with the kind of professional competence that came from surviving combat and learning from the experience. Home. The word settled in Sera's chest with unexpected weight. This was her territory now. These were her people. She belonged here in ways that went beyond political recognition or supernatural bonds. Garrett met them at the gates with expression that suggested news had arrived before they did. His greeting was characteristically direct. The council voted for recognition, 7-4. Dominic looked like he had swallowed glass when he announced the outcome. Word travels fast. Cade's tone carried dry amusement. Captain Cross has excellent intelligence contacts. We knew the vote totals within an hour of proceedings concluding. Garrett paused. The pack is relieved. There was genuine concern that the council would demand Lady Shadowborn's execution or imprisonment. The pack has my thanks for their concern. Sera kept her response formal, and my commitment to prove their faith was justified. You already proved it during battle. Garrett's voice carried conviction. Everything since then has just been politics catching up to reality. They entered the fortress together, returning to territory that felt more secure than when they had left. not because walls were thicker or defenses stronger, but because the pack that inhabited this space had been tested and survived. Bonds formed in combat were different from those created through daily routine, deeper, more resilient. That evening, alone in Cade's chambers that were slowly becoming their chambers, Sera finally allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The awakening, the battle, the council trial, the political implications that would shape her life going forward. It was overwhelming, exhausting, terrifying in ways that combat had not been, because physical danger was simple compared to navigating power structures designed to control people like her. Cade sensed her emotional state through the bond and moved to sit beside her. Did not try to fix anything or offer false reassurance. Simply provided solid presence that asked nothing and offered everything. "I do not know how to be what they need me to be." Sera's admission came quiet. "I know intelligence work, know how to move through spaces unseen, but being publicly visible as Shadowborn, leading by example, that requires skills I do not possess. You will learn, same as you learned everything else, through trial and error and determination." His hand found hers. "You are not expected to be perfect, just present. What if I fail? What if my mistakes get people hurt? Then you carry those mistakes and do better next time." That is what leadership means, not avoiding failure, but facing it and continuing anyway. The words settled something in Sera's chest, not eliminating fear, but providing framework to operate despite it. She had faced death during intelligence missions, had walked into situations where discovery meant execution, had survived through competence and courage, and refusing to quit even when circumstances suggested surrender was rational. This was just another mission. Different parameters, higher stakes, but fundamentally the same challenge. Survive, adapt, overcome. She could do this, would do this, because the alternative was returning to invisibility and fear, and she had already decided that hiding was no longer acceptable. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and dangerous, and filled with challenges she could only begin to anticipate. Dominic would watch her. Conservative pacts would look for reasons to justify their prejudices. Political complications would multiply as her existence continued to disrupt comfortable assumptions about power and hierarchy. But she would not face it alone. That made all the difference. Through the window, stars emerged in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia, ancient and constant, reminding her that present struggles were temporary against the vast sweep of time. Shadow Ridge had stood for 3 centuries, would stand for 3 more if its people remained vigilant, and Sera would stand with them, not as invisible intelligence operative, but as Lady Shadowborn, partner to their alpha, defender of territory that had given her home when she had nowhere else to belong. The mate bond thrummed between them, solid and real, carrying promise that whatever came next would be faced together, for better or worse, for triumph or tragedy. Together until the very end, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough.